And I ask you to bless this time in Jesus' name. Amen. So tonight was Jesus a copycat of pagan myths? And our speaker tonight is Joe Mulvihill, and he received his Master's of Arts in Theological Studies, magna cum laude at Lee University, and he was invited back to give the address at the 200th Centennial Celebration. Currently, he is in the PhD program in New Testament Studies at Northwest University in Potchefstroom, South Africa, scholarship winner. He has given talks on various subjects at Georgia Tech, Kennesaw State, and Lee University and Georgia State University. He's spoken on various topics at dozens of churches over the last decade. He has 10 years teaching experience, 2 at Lee University, and 10 with juniors and seniors at Mount Paran High School. He's an Eagle Award winner, Excellence in Teaching Award, and interim department chair of Bible and Theology, and he has been the substitute teacher for Dr. William Lane Craig's Defenders class on multiple occasions. You can all welcome Joe Mulvihill.
Happy to see a couple of students here, former students of mine. One in particular almost got me fired. I'm going to tell you the story real quick. Created a fake Twitter account for me and making fun of the institution at which I worked. Very creative, very funny jokes. But I got called in and literally just my boss began berating me. I know you did this, you did it. I've never had a Twitter account, don't plan to ever have one, and it was funny in the back, as you look back on it, but at the time it was almost a vocation trajectory change. It's a nice way of saying firing, but called fake Joe Mulvihill at Twitter. So I didn't even know, but I said, I gotta admit some of this is kind of funny. He's like, it's not funny. So anyway, so good to see you guys. Great to be with you. I'm glad you came out tonight. Like Jonathan said, this is my area of academic research. I have shifted. I've got 2 PhD directors now. I had one at Radboud University where I was a bursary or a scholarship winner there, but we've since shifted to people that were a little more interested in wanting to guide the research and see it to fruition. So I'm hoping to be finished in the spring or thereabouts in the spring or summer of 2016, but that is why you came to hear my background bio. But anytime a speaker comes to talk to you, you should ask why I should listen to this person. That's a very good question to ask. Is there any reason to listen to this person? So I'm hoping to provide you some reasons to disbelieve the idea that Jesus was just a copy from other cultures of their kind of hero or mythological god figures. That's what I've been doing for the last 4 or 5 years, and what I'm currently doing as well. So I'm going to try to do this in a number of stages. But before we get started, what began me on this journey, believe it or not, was a student of mine at the high school at which I worked, the academy there up the road. And he came in one morning and was really quite disturbed. Now, this particular student was at this point 17 years old. He'd been 17 years in the Christian faith, raised in a Christian family. I'd been 11 years at our institution. And he was quite disturbed by an internet YouTube sensationalist movie by Peter Joseph called Zeitgeist. I had no idea what this was at the time. I was just generally doing some general New Testament studies, theological studies, history of the faith, that sort of thing. And he came in and said, I had some friends. We watched part 1 and 2 of this Zeitgeist movie on YouTube. I don't know if you ever heard of it. Just at this point, it only had I think something like I don't know, like 250,000 hits. I think they're up to like 26 million now or something. So, but this documentary that Joseph put together, or it's supposed to be a documentary, had really affected the student so much so he's almost in tears. And he wasn't a kind of a cry-oriented student, if that makes sense to you. I'd never seen him even tear up about anything. So he basically had watched the first 2, and his friends, who were not believers from Wheeler High School, had said, well, we shouldn't show him the other part. And he said, what do you mean the other part? No, you're a believer, so you don't need to watch the other part. And he said, so what do you think happened? Right? He goes home and he can't go to sleep. He keeps looking at his laptop. Right? What do they mean the other part? What are they talking about? It's the same sort of idea that was that Bart Ehrman talks about when Ehrman, probably the world's most renowned New Testament skeptic, said he didn't really choose the title of his book, Misquoting Jesus, because there's actually no misquotes of Jesus in it. So the publisher wanted to catch the eyes of believers and go, what do you misquoting? Well, who's misquoted Jesus? What do you mean? I follow Jesus. What's So it's kind of that. Well, so he watches the thing and he comes in and talks to me. And one of the things I said is, I haven't watched this. I'll have to watch it tonight. and we'll talk tomorrow. So we came back the next day and I said, look, this isn't a short kind of 1, 2, 3. If this means enough to you, then let's meet for like a week and a half, you know, about 10 days, after school every day, and just work through these issues, one step at a time. I wanted to see if, you know, if he was committed to really working through this. It wasn't a kind of a quick, it didn't deserve that kind of thing if it affected him this way. And again, 18 years in the faith is going to walk away over a 45-minute video. So that's where I kind of got started with this thing. I wanted to see what was going on. So there are usually two methods or approaches given by proponents of what would be called the parallel thesis, or the mythical parallel, pagan parallel thesis. And the general sketch of the idea is just that, all right, if you're going to assume the Gospels are mythological, largely because they have supernatural elements in them, well, the next question is, well, why this series of myths? Why have they endured so long? Why their existential power, right? And for some, they've said, okay, so, you know, the reason why is, even if you look at famous genius-level agnostics like Voltaire in France, he said, well, if Jesus wasn't a real figure, then we should fall at the knees of the Gospel authors because they created the most enduring and powerful fiction ever created. Ever. Far outstripping Homer and Tolkien in the modern era. It's not even close. So the question becomes, where did these authors get this kind of narrative? And so for some, few, not a lot, but for some they say, well, this is just another copycat of the hero myths and mythical gods in other cultures outside of first century Palestinian Hebrew, the orbit of theological Hebrew in first century Palestine. So that's their explanation of the cause of it. Well, then why would it be such an existentially powerful narrative? Well, because it's just sort of recapitulating the same things that these other humans have created in their minds. It's basically just a Jewish amalgamation, like a patchwork quilt of all these different features. And so then they endeavor to show a connection between these former antecedent mythical figures and heroes and Jesus. There are two general ways, two approaches that I wanted to bring to your attention tonight that are the most common ways used. The first is that you find an ancient mythological character or a series of characters, maybe 2 or 3, and then you mine that data for points of interest in the narrative. And then you pull that out of that narrative and you place it over on the Jesus narrative and say, oh, look at the connections we found. We do this all the time when we make parallel arguments. We compare things. Now, one of the dangers of doing a comparison is not including differences. You know, you can make a parallel between just about anything if you don't include differences. This is technically called the fallacy of the undistributed middle, when you fail to distribute the differences between two things. I'll give you an easy example to follow, right? I have eyes, I have ears. An elephant has eyes and ears. Mulvihill is a pachyderm. I've just made an invalid parallel because what? I've ignored differences and distinctions. In fact, massively important ones between myself, right, Homo sapien, and a pachyderm. So the thing you have to be careful about is this idea. So probably the number one, this is cool. For a guy who works with a whiteboard, this is nirvana. But there was a Scottish anthropologist named James Fraser that published a massive work where he was probably the most popular proponent of this thesis in the early 20th century, early 1900s, called The Golden Bough. And he basically was trying to take a number of mythical characters and say, well, look at these features, they look like Jesus. They really do. Now, Fraser's work's been largely discredited for a number of reasons. I'll give you some of them as we go on. But one of the things you can appreciate about Fraser is he actually offers at least 3 concrete parallels. Adonis, Attis, and Osiris. He had those 3 guys. He's got a section, a chapter in his book on the Golden Bough on these 3 and their connection to Jesus. The good part, the wonderful part about somebody offering concrete examples is you can actually evaluate the parallel. What you want to avoid at all costs is people that go, well, it's just kind of in the air. Even modern academics that believe in this mythic parallel thesis, they protect their thesis from being evaluated by not offering anything that you can look at to compare. So they'll say something like this, well, you know, it's kind of in the air, you know, the idea of God-man and dying for sins and coming back to life, that was kind of in the air back then. Well, you can't really evaluate that. You just got to take their word on it. It's just kind of in the air. Well, give me some examples, right? And that's one thing we can appreciate about James Fraser is he gives concrete examples. Now, a lot of people refer to his examples and others that are offered individual examples, like, for example, Hercules, A big one years ago was Mithra, or that's the Iranian version, Mithras and the Roman version. Peter Joseph bets all the money on Horus, the Egyptian god, falcon-headed god. But when you do these sort of things, it's nice to have a target. All right, now can I go look at the Mithra material, or the Hercules material, or the Horus material, and make a comparison, and, most crucially, look at the differences as well. So, what about this? There's two issues with this, the two main issues of why most scholars don't come to the conclusion that the parallel, I don't know, maybe I should move back a little bit. Most scholars, Jesus scholars and ancient classicists and historians do not buy this idea. They don't. There's a number of reasons for that. I'm going to give you examples and quotes from people that are not conservative, evangelical conservatives, that say this very same thing. But they don't. Well, why don't most scholars buy it? Well, most of the time they say when a figure is offered, they would call these similarities superficial. Sometimes they call them weak. Sometimes they call these features of when they offer a concrete person and then you actually mine the data, they say they're outright misleading. Yeah, give you an example. It's if you look across, like for example, in the I'll use that one later. Sorry, if you look at the Hercules data, right? You can say, well, look, Hercules was birthed like a hybrid god on Earth. Well, there you go. Hercules was remarkably powerful. Jesus had power over almost his entire environment, great command over everything, mentally and physically. So yeah, I mean, Hercules kind of had a deification at the end of his life. Well, when you go to the actual accounts, you find these things right next to all these dissimilarities that are radically different than the Jesus picture. For example, when it talks about Hercules' great power over the environment, he literally takes a river, somehow in the myth grabs the river and pulls it over and cleans out stables as one of the tasks he was assigned to do, which I don't know if you've ever read that about. That's not even in Jesus' mythology, 200 years after the Jesus accounts. You know, when you look at Hercules, kind of his resurrection, there was no real resurrection. He was hit, he was on a mountain, on a hill. He was on a mountain, he got hit by a bolt of lightning and then disappeared. And then the next thing we get is him talking with Daddy Zeus. So when you start looking at these, the reason scholars call them superficial is because they ignore differences and they have to force these connections. And sometimes call them outright misleading because the minute you go out to the original source documentation, things fall apart. That's something to remember. When you're talking to somebody, you just say, look, can you give me a reference to a source? I want to read the source. You know? It's like somebody you'd never met me and you had no clue what an elephant was. They say, well, Mulvihill is an elephant, right? He has eyes and ears. And you're like, well, I need to probably meet Mulvihill and know what an elephant is, right? Part of the beauty of this first approach is you can actually compare it. And when they actually go and do comparisons, scholars find these to be really, really unpersuasive. A second problem is that when you start looking at people that spend the majority, anywhere between 25 and 35, 40 years of their life studying these individual mythical figures, they do not believe this is an adequate parallel. So when you go to specialists over these individual figures, or specialists in the era of mythology around the time that these myths were made, in the antecedent, that means before first century Judaism where Jesus was, they're not convinced. They think this is an utterly ridiculous sort of approach. As a matter of fact, in my PhD research, I've had to pump up the argument to make it valid. Y'all ever heard of somebody charging windmills, Don Quixote? I'm going for it, right? What you don't want to do in a PhD thing is find something that's so weak that somebody can, you know, so I'm actually trying to help the argument along in my research. Let me give you maybe a classic example. I mentioned earlier the former Iranian Mithra, and which gets adopted by the Romans and becomes Mithras. Now, Mithras was worshipped widely, was worshipped as part of the Iranian and Persian pantheon, as well as the Roman pantheon as well, and became what they call a mystery religion, a little later, a very secretive cult with secretive rites. About around, we got evidence of this rising around 190 to 200 AD, well after the alleged events of Jesus' life, death, and resurrection. And what you find is, let me give you some scholars' names. The scholars that are the most respected with regard to Mithra, mythology and ethos in the time period is there's a gentleman named Giovanni Casadio, Walter Burkert, Richard Gordon, Alison Griffith, Manfred Klaus, and Gary Lees. Now those names shouldn't mean anything to you because you're not in this world. But these are all undisputed experts on Mithras that have spent minimally 20 plus years of their life looking at the mythos. None of them say this parallel works. None of them. I go online and everybody's like, Mithra, yeah. None of them. They outright will say it doesn't work. A couple of reasons. One, there's no death or resurrection in Mithra or Mithras. That's a kind of a key thing. It's a central event in Jesus' life, right? It's not there. The specialists also say for people that say this sort of thing, they either don't understand the origin of the cult or they're just trying to throw another person, another mythical figure up there that might fit. Were there times where Mithras did miracles in the myth? Well, yeah. Were they largely healing? No. Was Mithras worshipped widely and beloved? Yeah. Is Mithras an actual historical figure? Probably not. But the point is, most of the specialists say there's just no connection here. That's another surprising thing, right? You have these claims you see online. I normally say there's decent arguments online, but it's also a place where bad arguments go to get resurrected, to excuse the pun. It's just, you get some, that's one of the, I'm not, I said I'll never be on Twitter like this, I'm some above it or something. It's frustrating. You get a lot of bad arguments and a lot of frustrating things where there's no filter. You know what I mean? And for a guy like me, it's just, that's all it is. It's just more frustrating. It doesn't mean it's some sort of negative thing if you happen to be on that social network. The second way of doing this is I think you might find pretty interesting, is where you offer a composite sketch of features that are what they would call generic features of what constituted a hero myth, right? Or a myth about a really, really, really impressive god or goddess. And then you try to go through and check off Jesus, where he matches it. And then if somehow you get more matches than not, then there he is. See, we knew it. This is technically called, from a scholar named Joseph Campbell, a very, very prominent myth scholar, American myth scholar.
George Lucas was influenced by.
Exactly, yeah, George Lucas was heavily influenced by his book called Hero with 1,000 Faces. There's heroes in every culture, and they just keep recapitulating. Campbell came up with what's called a monomyth thesis. Monomyth is the idea that there's a sort of a general casting you could look at. If somebody's going to make it big in the myth world, they need to have these features connected to them. They actually do both individual comparisons, a la Fraser and Zeitgeist, and then they do this thing where they say there are 200. They say there are 200 plus parallels that are significant parallels between Jesus and Mithras. And interestingly, they're kind of in the background of the video, and they scroll up so fast you can't read them. Okay. Well, one of the first things I did when this student came to me and I watched the video that very night, I slowed down, and you'd be surprised how weak some of these. I'll give you a couple of examples. These were called in the video staggering parallels, where they kind of do so they do the individual James Fraser movie. They say Jesus is a lot like Adonis, Osiris, and mostly Horus in the Egyptian religion. Well, other times they'll just offer these staggering parallels in a row and produce them so fast you have to slow the video down to follow it. One is that Jesus was a fisherman, right? We know Jesus, well no, he said he'd make his disciples fishers of men. He wasn't necessarily a fisherman. He's called God of the mountain in one of the parallels. There's no data that indicates Jesus was a god in a mountain. He's also called the healer in the mountain. You mine all the sources, no one ever, even heretics never called him a healer in the mountain. They refer to Joseph, Mary, and Jesus as the Trinity, and that was an Islamic mistake, but that's actually in the video as a parallel there. Jesus the Weeper, Jesus referred to as founder of not of a movement, but founder of a political entity. Jesus also being unisexed or hermaphroditic. I don't know where, this is where you sort of, like, what is going on here? There's a reason why they flip it through so fast. You're like, oh, okay, wait a second. So one of the things you find is even when you go this sort of generic route, and you put up this sort of general this is how in the ancient world a myth would sort of achieve superstar status, or a hero myth, whether it's a god or a hero. What's the difference between those two? A hero would be someone that has a lot of time on earth. A god would be someone either in the heavens or in Hades or something like that in this supernatural realm beyond our three-dimensional reality. The two guys to remember with this, the first guy who offered before Campbell the idea of a general composite sketch of kind of the superstar features of a god or a hero was a gentleman named Lord Raglan. He offered a 12-point checklist for hero figures, of which Jesus only meets 3. The guy that came after this, probably the modern proponent of this, basically Campbell came after him, and after Campbell, Alan Dundas. I think he's dead too, unfortunately, so I don't want to say, I'll just say, I'll be insulting if he isn't. I want to say the late Alan Dundas just to be safe, but Alan Dundas offers 22 general features, right, that should be connected. Now, when you watch other videos besides Zeitgeist, like popular atheist videos online, if they ever touch this subject, they'll usually reference Alan Dundas' 22-point list. And claim that Jesus meets most of these. Well, when you go through the list, you find that Jesus, and by my count, Jesus met 3 of the 22. That's not a very strong composite sketch. What are some of the things Jesus didn't meet in Dundy's list? Jesus overcomes a king, giant, or a dragon. I don't remember that part. He reigns uneventfully. I don't really remember that. I don't even remember him reigning in a political sense. Driven from the throne of his city. Not buried. Having children that don't succeed him to the throne. Father attempts to kill him. You don't have these sort of things. You go, oh, well, but what about Herod? The point is, you really have a lot of dissimilarities even in the general list. So whether you have the particulars or the general, you have a lot of dissimilarity to deal with. Remember, whenever we're making a parallel, we want to distribute the differences so that we can make an accurate categorization attempt. When this happens, it drains credibility from the schema. Not only when Jesus doesn't meet the majority of them, but also when some people have to cheat to make the list work, like the Zeitgeist video, where they just cheat by scrolling them up real fast, or when these atheist websites just assume things like, well, his dad didn't try to kill him, but Herod did, or he was kind of a king, he has a throne in heaven. You know, so when you cheat like that with these lists, it just drains credibility from the entire schema. The last reason that I give you 2 reasons to kind of be at least a little bit skeptical, right, of the idea of offering an individual person, an individual figure. I'll give you 1 reason to be skeptical of this too. Is when they offer the general schema, the kind of big, large, casting the net really, really large. What you find is that Jesus doesn't fit the categories, 1, and 2, when people have to cheat or kind of play with words to make it work, it drains credibility. What's another reason, though, to reject this? Here it is. We have clearly affirmed historical figures that meet these lists and are like, meet 11 points to 18 points on the list. Let me give you some that no one questions their historicity. People that would fit the majority, that would be half or over half of the Dundy's 22-point list, would be Napoleon, Hitler, Winston Churchill, JFK, William Wallace, and Julius Caesar. Now, nobody has any serious doubts about the historicity. They don't think this was an amalgamated myth with these figures, but these figures fit the list better than Jesus. Do you understand the point? If you're going to call the fact that you've met this list and the majority of it, first they don't give us a method as to, well, how do we know if it's like between 11 and 12 points, does that mean it likely is it, or is that not likely? And how do we know, do you have to meet all 22? So usually they don't give you a method of evaluation. And also we have beings that actually hit more of the target than Jesus that aren't ever questioned as far as their historic personality or historic entity on the landscape. So in that sense, those are the 2 reasons why even the monolith approach doesn't really work with Jesus. The last thing to remember with both of these approaches is that 2 things can have a lot in common and not be the same. You know? It's one thing to say there's some commonalities, right? It's another thing to say these commonalities make it a genetic connection, like one led to the other. I'll give you an example. Before the Titanic sank in its maiden voyage, there was another large ship that was said to be unsinkable that hit an iceberg and sunk called the Titan. Now, if we're going with this, we think, well, either the Titan or the Titanic is a false one because it's so close. The parallels are staggering. But no one would say, well, right, we have a lot of good historic information that indicates they both were real, built things that really had these tragedies happen to them. So again, 2 things can have a lot of things in common, and you got to do a little more work to connect them by way of borrowing or some sort of an intentional sort of patchwork quilt approach by the gospel authors. All right, I mentioned earlier this whole approach has either been ignored or rejected by modern Jesus scholars. I'm going to give you a list of Jesus scholars that are neither conservative nor evangelical, that think this entire way of approaching a critique of the Gospels, there's other ways to critique the Gospels, they think this whole approach is bankrupt. And I'll give you quotes from them. The first guy I'm going to bring you is arguably one of the most prestigious Jesus scholars on the scene today, a guy named James D.G. Dunn. In the Dictionary of Jesus and the Gospels, he says this very clearly: myth is a term of at least doubtful relevance to the study of Jesus and the Gospels. And then he goes on to say, parallels are generally pretty spurious. Spurious means false, right? Second guy I wanted to bring you is a gentleman that, again, you're not supposed to have heard of these guys, but these are non-evangelical, non-conservative Jesus scholars, some of which don't even believe that Jesus was Messiah and resurrected for our sins, that are saying these things about this particular way of critiquing. This gentleman I'm going to bring you now is a guy named Gerhard Kittel, a European scholar that's written, I think, about almost half a dozen books on historic Jesus studies. The Oriental myth of the dying and rising Savior God, as instantiated in Tammuz, Belmarduk, Adonis, Heracles, that's Hercules of Tarsus, Attis, Osiris, the Cretan Zeus, Dionysus, and Mithras, constitutes neither the native soil of the gospel nor any true parallel to it. Again, this is not a guy that shares our conviction, that has spent a majority of his life at least looking at Jesus studies and studies of the time period, saying this is not the place to go. You don't need to go outside of the orbit of theological first century Palestinian Judaism to find out who Jesus was or try to make sense of the narrative event. The next guy, James Orr, I'm not sure where he is on the spectrum, but he is a well-respected Jesus scholar. He says the mythical comparison thesis simply lacks any historical foundation or relies too much on highly questionable comparisons. We cannot dismiss facts by pointing to artificial mythical origins. The next gentleman was a guy who my mentor got to work with, William Lane Craig, worked with Wolfhard Pannenberg. Pannenberg is a very well-respected liberal Jesus scholar, and he says this: the legend and myth thesis altogether is a wrong way of trying to explain who Jesus is. In addition, the assumed diffusion of ideas of the resurrected gods into Judaism and Christianity has anything but been proven. In other words, he would just say, well, look, not only are the parallels weak, but we don't really have any archaeological or textual data that would say that there was a massive infusion of mythical ideas in Palestine, even though it was under Roman rule, Greco-Roman rule. Two more will be done here. Gunter Bornkamm, right? This is another European scholar, not in our wheelhouse, but Jesus scholar that looks at this stuff all the time. Bornkamm points out there's a decisive lack of common ground between this mythic parallel theory and the New Testament narratives. And if you don't remember any of them, everybody probably, or maybe has at least heard of, the most popular New Testament skeptic on the planet, Bart Ehrman. Bart Ehrman works at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Ehrman wrote a book called Did Jesus Exist?, where he just takes this whole idea apart. And he's like, look, there's a number of ways to critique the Gospels. I don't think any of them work either, or I wouldn't be here. But he says that the last thing you want to do is say that either Jesus didn't exist or was a completely fabricated, made-up myth, or that parallels were kind of other mythic hero figures were kind of patched together for Jesus. He basically says this entire approach is bankrupt. And from a guy with his prestige, saying this sort of thing doesn't mean he's automatically right. But for a guy who's made quite a handsome living critiquing our religious faith, our theological convictions, and our primary source documents, this is a really big blow. So one of the things to remember is that whenever you go outside of the orbit of first century Jewish Palestinian thought, you're already on shaky ground with the current group of Jesus scholars. You're already on shaky ground. So if you're going to go outside and say, okay, I'm going to go out to Rome and talk about Mithras. I'm going to go out to Persia and talk about Mithra. I'm going to go out to the antecedent Greek scenario and talk about Adonis or Osiris, or even talk about Hercules, right, or Zeus, or even as far back as Baal in some of the ancient Near Eastern mythological data. Okay, so 3 things to just caution you as we kind of wrap up here. Just to remember, not to get too, this has been a pretty negative evaluation of this thesis, but I wanted to give you a couple words of caution if you ever talk to anybody about this. The first thing I've already kind of mentioned, that you want to make sure that somebody can prove borrowing. It's not enough to say there's a couple common features. Remember, ears and eyes, elephant? What you need is a preponderance of common features that have underlying structural similarities. I'll give you one on this. Krishna is called the shepherd god in some of the Vedic accounts in the Hindu religion. Jesus has been called the good shepherd. So look at that, right? Well, that makes far more sense coming from a Jewish background, because Krishna was actually a shepherd, literally a shepherd. Jesus is metaphorically speaking of the lost sheep in the diaspora of Israel. So that it doesn't, even though there's a similarity of name there, you have to go, well, are there underlying conceptual similarities at the level of structure? And it just doesn't seem to work out that way. To call Jesus the being in the water because he got baptized is just, you know what I mean? And so to say, well, he's a lot like Neptune. That's reaching and grabbing at what they would call a weak or superficial parallel, and even misleading in some way. Second thing, even though I can't think of, or I haven't been able to find one single case of Christians clearly borrowing essential theological themes and bringing them over into our worldview, there are some parts of our history where we intentionally borrowed, where Christian leaders intentionally, like Christmas. It's a Roman festival. I don't have a problem with celebrating Christmas, but that was an intentional sort of co-opting of this pagan festival. They're all worshiping their pagan gods at this point. Why don't we worship the true God on December 25th? I'm not sure there's a scholar that would say Jesus was born on December 25th. Most think it was in the spring. There's good textual evidence to think that's the time period when it happened. The idea of using wedding rings, incense, and sprinkling in some Christian religious ceremonies were intentionally and clearly adopted, where they just say, we're going to take this. This is something that is common in paganism. We're going to take it and give it to the real God, the God of the universe, through Jesus Christ. So just make sure you remember that that there are some commonalities between things, especially like statues. Like, for example, the Catholic Church's decision to name their churches after saints. Well, that was a Roman thing to name all your temples after a god or a hero. But that's something they literally wrote and told the public, we're doing this on purpose. We're co-opting this. So just be aware there are some examples of intentional borrowing in our historic tradition. But when it comes to the person of Jesus, the events of his life, and the theological sort of implications and underpinnings of the Gospels, you don't really have a lot of hard data that would prove that. The last thing is to remember is don't lump all the mythers, Jesus mythers, together. They're a varied group. Okay, you have Lawrence Krauss, the loudmouth atheist critic of Christianity. That's a physicist that believes this theory. He's been asked this in question and answer. He doesn't know what to say. He just says, "This is my best way of explaining the Jesus, the power of the Jesus narrative existentially." You have other people like there's a woman named Dolores Murdoch. Dolores Murdoch goes by an internet handle, Ankyria, which just means teacher. And Murdoch is usually made fun of. By the way, this is the primary source that Peter Joseph got almost all his information. It's something that legitimate scholars, though they don't hold a post at a major university, but the legitimate scholars that hold this thesis that you have to deal with would be Richard Carrier, who doesn't work at a university. He was kind of a professional atheist, debated a number of Christians in the past. Bill Craig, Michael Licona, that sort of thing. Robert Price would be another, who to say he's on the fringe of Jesus scholarship would be an understatement. He said that the Jesus seminar was, the people that were part of the Jesus seminar were too conservative, which is hilarious because they said, oh, you can only get to about 5% of what Jesus said in that seminar. And then last is a guy named Dennis McDonald, who's a Harvard grad working at Claremont University up north that has the same sort of thing. But all of them take shots at the non-professionals that try this sort of thing. Like Ankyria has no advanced degree. It doesn't mean she's wrong, she doesn't have an advanced degree, but she hadn't spent the majority of her life looking at these things. She makes a number of unsubstantiated claims. She's the one that in the Zeitgeist video, that was from her work that decided that Jesus' 12 disciples are connected to the 12 members of the zodiacal, this sort of thing. Probably the least persuasive part. She also believes this is just a recapitulation of gods and heroes and that sort of thing. But you have somebody like Robert Price, who's got 2 PhDs in theological studies, saying she's loony, or this is outright crazy. Don't pay attention to anything she says. Throw it all out. So don't lump them all together. There's Peter Joseph's hilarious documentary. That's not really somebody solid. Talk about charging a windmill. You wouldn't go after one of the primary sources of Peter Joseph's documentary, a very big online presence in Ankyria S. or Dolores Murdoch. But when you deal with somebody like Price or Richard Carrier or Dennis McDonald, you've got to do a little bit more work because they have a much more nuanced view. So don't just lump them all together. Like, for example, Carrier doesn't say that Jesus never existed. He said that's absolutely ridiculous. But he does say there may have been something in the air, and that's where the gospel writers got all their ideas. let me finish with this story, and it might help you guys, especially considering the fact that Zeitgeist puts all their money on Horus, the Egyptian god that's supposed to be a precursor to Jesus. Years ago, there was a famous apostate, somebody that turned on Christianity, named Tom Harper. He was a Canadian journalist that taught theology for a while, got a degree in theology. Probably the most known pre-internet, most known commentator on religion in Canada. Big name, Tom Harper. There was a Canadian theologian named Ward Gask that read his work. What work was that? Harper wrote a book where he said, look, if you look back at some of these guys from the late 1800s and the early 1900s, what you find is that Jesus was most likely an amalgam, like a patchwork quilt figure put together by all Egyptian themes, from theology to activity to birth event to death and resurrection. All Egyptian. He pulled off the work of non-professionals and non-academics like a gentleman named, Massey, Kuhn, Jeffrey Higgins. These are three guys that were kind of sensationalists. They weren't exactly professional academics by any stretch of the imagination. Harper called them geniuses and said, I've had a revolution in my thought about Jesus. So Gask tried to figure out, now how am I going to test this? Because Gask is a theologian in Canada. He's like, well, if Tom Harper's right, I need to dump Christianity. So what can I do? He's like, how do you get at this? The guys he's referencing are long dead. They can't be questioned. Their works aren't exactly professionally done. So what am I going to do? So Gask had an idea. And what he did is he said, I'm going to contact, after I determine this, the 25 world's 25 most respected Egyptologists. And I'm going to first say, what do you think about Tom Harper's thesis? First, have you heard of the three guys, Higgins, Kuhn, and Massey, that he references? None of them had heard of him. Second, he goes, well, why do you think these are so impressive to Mr. Harper? And they said, I don't know, but I will say this. Prior to the 1900s, everybody was an expert in Egyptology because, we had no way of interpreting hieroglyphics, Rosetta Stone, that sort of thing. So this would explain a lot about Mormonism as well. Joseph Smith was an expert in translating Egyptian, Reformed Egyptian, a language we've never heard of. But anyway, then he says, okay, let me give you all the parallels he gives in the book, all of them. At this point, there were 30 parallels that he mined out of Harper's book that Harper got from these former, these antecedent authors. Not one of them. Not one of the 25 world-respected on every continent Egyptologists approved one of the parallels. Not one. They didn't even say, well, this one could partially be true if you kind of massage it. Not one. So Gask wrote a book, of which I don't have the title off the top of my head right now, but Gask wrote a book where he said, look, there's not an Egyptologist, a professional academic Egyptologist alive that would support what Harper's saying, even though it was a wildly successful book, just like the New Atheist profusion of literature in our world. So anyway, I just wanted to give you kind of a story of a more recent, not really that, I mean, it was basically early 90s, of an event where somebody attempted to test this thesis, where it's real slippery and kind of hard to get your hands on. Because one of the things in Harper's book is he doesn't mention a lot of actual mythical figures you can compare Jesus to go to their original source and look at that sort of thing. But that's another thing to be aware of is make sure you ask for original source documentation so you can look at the parallel yourself. One of the things I'm attempting to do with the book I'm going to try to get published when I get done with my doctorate is I'm just going to have a reference for any layperson, at least about death and resurrection. Hopefully it will turn into a series. We can go 12 disciples, healing ministry, exorcisms. But the idea is, okay, if somebody says, I think Jesus is kind of like, well, I don't know, Hercules, you can go right to the Hercules data. You have the New Testament data here, you have the Hercules data here, and you can compare them. Original source citation. That's something you never see Jesus mentors do. They never put it up alongside each other because they know the differences are overwhelming similarities. They know this. Remember, like the Hercules, right, cleaning the Aegean stables out. Last thing, if you are writing any of this down or come back to the video, I wanted to suggest that if you're interested in looking into this more at I think a pretty accessible lay level, but a little bit higher than a college level, you can get a book by two very well-respected academic ancient scholars of the ancient world. Whoa, there you go. Greg Boyd, and Paul Eddy. These two guys wrote a book called, very simple to remember, the Jesus Legend. The Jesus Legend. In the book, they literally say, I know most people don't take Tom Price seriously, or Richard Carey. They don't. I mean, but you know what we are? If there's something to this claim, let's look at it. And they go after every single angle on this. And I think do an astounding job. I don't know if you know it. I've talked to Boyd before about this book. He goes, you know, Paul Eddy, they both graduated, Eddie graduated from Marquette University. And, you know, they're real heavy research guys there. And this book started out at 130 pages. It blew up to 400 because Eddie said, I'm going to try to cover every angle. Because I don't think there's anything to this. But we're going to try to cover every single angle as best we can. So if you want to pick up the Jesus Legend, it's a fantastic book in that sense. So with that, let's get to the more interesting part. Enough of the monologue. Let's do some dialogue, right? Sounds fun. All right, yeah. Okay, yes.
I thought you said Richard Carey does believe Jesus existed. I thought he did. Didn't
He
doesn't he even have a lecture though called?
He does. He has over the years kind of moved, right, where he'll say, I'll at least affirm the possibility of his existence. There was a time where he said no, but I think currently, that's one of the hard things about Carey is it's like trying to nail Jello to a wall. You can't really, you know what I'm saying? I mean, again, if somebody's is gonna make this parallel claim to say it's kind of in the air. These things were in the air, you know. Well, first, you didn't live in the first century, and second, help me understand how it's in the air. And if it's in the air, how Jesus is an example of this sort of thing. You need to do more work than that. So I would say he would say his view on Jesus' existence has been very nuanced. It fluctuates between he's not there and he could possibly be there. But he would be skeptical about.
Does he actually use the phrase "it's in the air"?
Oh yes, and it was just kind of believed. Like this idea of people walking out of tombs was just common. The idea that there was a God-man hybrid walking among us was just common. That's why it's really important to get down to, when you actually nail it down, like he uses two, what's beautiful is when people have questioned him online, he's finally gotten into saying, okay, well, look, here's two examples. You need an example, I'll give you examples, right? Romulus and Zalmoxis. And these are the two guys in my PhD I go after because of these two. Price also kind of gives a nod to these two guys as well. Now, Dennis McDonald actually goes a whole other way. He actually says, I'm only going to use Achilles and Perseus and Odysseus, because he's only going to work with the Iliad and the Odyssey, which makes it really, really hard because the Iliad and the Odyssey are radically different than the Gospels. But he does his level best to, so, you know, at some point Odysseus falls asleep. Well, Jesus fell asleep in a boat. You know, so you kind of, okay, I mean, it's radically, it's just like, you went to Harvard. So, so yeah, so you actually get some targets to aim at, thankfully, out of Carrier, and they still fail, but that's at least nice to have that instead of just this sort of general vague. Because look, if somebody just says it's just sort of in the air, you can't really evaluate it. You just got to take their word for it. Any other questions at all that you might think? Yes?
Well, I want to appreciate, just your emphasis on getting to the sources and looking at things, because, I think all of us as human beings are very tempted to form quick biases instead of looking at things that's really good.
Yes.
And also, just wonder if you could speak on the Epic of Gilgamesh and sort of the comparison with the flood, and because I actually, recently read it or listened to it actually, and the story. He actually in the epic. I don't think it was Gilgamesh, it was someone else in the epic that actually took his family into an ark during a flood, and because of that he received eternal life. Gilgamesh met him later on in his journey.
This is really interesting. When this originally was, when they first were able to start interpreting these Babylonian stelas and templates and things like this, you had them going, well, maybe there's something here, right? And I think the big thing in the Gilgamesh is the flood as a judgment. And then there's another thing they really focus on, which is the dove scenario. Is there a dove to see if it's, so you remember reading that. I will say this, believe it or not, most Gilgamesh scholars don't think this is a substantial parallel. They don't think this is enough to say this influenced the Hebrews. Further, this complicates matters significantly as well. In nearly every ancient Near Eastern culture, there's a flood judgment scenario. Some are very, very grounded in reality, like the Noah scenario. Some are, and not the Noah movie, with the angel stone golems anyway. So, but others are really fanciful and mythological. But I was surprised to see that people that don't share our worldview at all don't consider this to be a strong enough parallel. Although they are interesting, but they center hardcore on the dove and this sort of deluge and this sort of you're floating and salvation, that sort of thing. This is based on the fact that Gilgamesh was supposed to be connected to what was it? supposed to have some sort of divine parentage. There's another dissimilarity, right? Noah isn't said to have divine parentage in any way. God didn't birth him. He wasn't pre-existent like the Son and that sort of thing. So before we leave, give me your email, and I'll just send you what these guys say. You can look at it and say, well, yeah, I'm glad you went to the source yourself. You can see why they tended to shy away from this thing. The last reason. We actually have a pretty definitive way of seeing if something's borrowed. For example, there are scholars that spend decades going, okay, I need to have a really rigorous criteria for saying something like, okay, maybe the Hercules epic came from, let's say, the Assyrian culture. Well, if you're going to say that, you can't just take a couple of superficial similarities or weak ones and just throw them together. So, believe it or not, they've got a pretty rigorous sort of, and that's one of the things I do in my doctoral dissertation, is I say, okay, to try to eliminate bias, I'm going to take people that don't agree with our worldview, that study myth their entire lives, and I'm going to try to put together their criteria, and then we're going to run these guys right beside Jesus through their criteria. People that say, okay, we can say from a scholarly and an academically respectable place that, not certainly, but more likely than not, this led to this. You know, so how do they do that? So that's one of the things that I'm looking at in it. So you have to have a pretty rigorous sort of way of looking at underlying conceptual similarities versus differences. You have to look at word similarity. You have to look at whether it's before it. If it's not before it, it can't inform it, right? You have to, I don't look at the text data. That would take too long because some of the texts we have are very, very late. That means they could have been adjusted, in light of the popularity of the Jesus movement. Mm-hmm. You also have to look at the idea of whether, how much you're going to weight dissimilarities. And that's important because in anything in life, the differences are much more crucial most of the time than similarities are. Mm-hmm. If I had 2 pills in front of me, white, chalky, same size, circular, same weight, I mean, maybe they're the same, but if one's aspirin, one's arsenic, that's one significant difference that would outweigh all the similarities. So you have to have a rigorous method, and that's something you don't see with these guys either. And I think that's one of the reasons why Gilgamesh scholars that aren't involved in the Jesus debate at all would say we're just a little slow to jump over here because people can make so many mistakes with parallel claims. And even, like I said, even if you get a lot of things that are similar, and you have 3 really big ones with the Noah scenario, you still have some work to do to say that this was borrowed by the Hebrews. How so? Is there, do we have epigraphic, meaning, non-scroll based, but epigraphic archaeological information that would say there's a significant cross-cultural pollination going on? If not, then you're just making a claim based on a couple of similarities, right? Mm-hmm. So you have to be careful of that too. But let's look up with the email and I'll try to show you. You can evaluate whether their hesitancy is warranted, even though they don't share our worldview. They don't think the Bible, most of the guys that are studying don't have a pulled a brief of the Bible. Anybody else? No? Yes.
The Bill Crushy said that maybe the chorus, maybe they had a glimpse of Christ coming.
Okay, good point. I didn't want to, I didn't think I had time to go over this sort of thing, but there are some people that think, I'll give you an example. C.S. Lewis, he said, Christianity is myth come true, right? And so he said, look, there's a sort of a general longing by everyone on the planet that we can see features of what this being might be like in general revelation. You get more specifics in special revelation, salvation-oriented specifics, but people have this sort of general longing, right? And so Lewis said, look, there are some similarities in some of the myths, but interestingly, Lewis, who read myth his entire life, literary expert in ancient myth, said you just can't call it a myth, though. It doesn't fit the genre. So nobody with a straight face is going to call this myth. You may have a problem with the supernatural elements in it. Fair enough. But you can't call this myth. It resists a mythological interpretation for Lewis. But Lewis said, I'm more than willing to concede that these are kind of inadequate clawings at what humans want in a redeemer or a savior or a hero. You know what I'm saying? So I'll give you an example. When I was doing my master's, there was a group of guys that met, and they were going over a book called The Jesus Mysteries. The Jesus Mysteries. And this was done by 2 non-professional academics that, Carrier and Price tend to make fun of. That basically said, all right, look, this is the parallel thesis all over again, right? In the book, these guys were going through it, and these poor guys at my school, one was a psychology major, the other guy was a marketing, no, even worse, a communications major. I was a communications major, that's why I know it's, they tell you, master of everything, right? Or not master of nothing, you're good at everything. So sorry if I insulted the communications major, but I'm just telling you, it was a rough going after I got fooled again. This would be anyway. So these guys were going through it, and I remember coming by them at lunch, and I had no idea about the parallel thesis at this point. But I come by them at lunch, and they're like, you know what, we got almost through the whole book, and where'd y'all come down on? I had no idea about this, and I'd never really heard of it. It got popularized by Peter and Joseph later. But they said, well, we just say that, maybe there's some similarities because people just wanted Jesus and they were willing to make up anything that looked like Jesus. And I thought, man, that is weak. It may be true that there are some similarities because of this sort of universal longing for a higher power. But to pass off what they were offering as just, I don't want to do the hard work of actually getting the data and looking at it. You know what I mean? Like this gentleman just said. That came on, and it should come off to you as weak, but I think there's a nugget of truth in there, and the idea that, okay, with regard to the idea that it's maybe there is something, right, that Lewis was talking about, like there's some sort of a longing going on there, right, and that sort of thing. I'll give you a follow-up in just a second, but did you have a question?
Yeah, I was wondering if there's a way to look at scholars from different backgrounds,
Yes.
because it seems that if you are a scholar that grew up in the Christian worldview, if I was to read something super foreign,
Yes.
I would interpret it through the Christian worldview,
Sure.
and then of course find similarities.
Yes.
So I would assume that scholars that are native to the culture that the myth comes from
Yes.
would maybe have a different point of view.
So great. Glad you said this. How are we looking on time?
It's 8:52.
Okay, I only have red. Just give me probably the most definitive study done to date, as far as rigorously academic on this subject. I use a lot of it in my thesis. Is called The Riddle of the Resurrection by a Swedish scholar named Trygrave Medinger. Trygrave Medinger. And Medinger says, look, I wasn't raised a Christian, but I'm going to try to come at this. He's a specialist in myth in the ancient world, and he attempts to try to figure out, is there anything to this idea that there's like a sort of a proto-God idea of a dying and rising God? Now, he feels like that he kind of might get a possibility. He's very tentative. The whole first chapter of the book, he says, look, almost everybody thinks that this whole idea is ridiculous that's in the scholarly world. I'm going to go the other way and try to mine some ancient data and try to figure this out. Interestingly, he says the best candidate for this sort of thing is Baal. Baal, the ancient Near Eastern Semitic god, the one mentioned a lot in the Old Testament. Unfortunately, the Baal return story has like him having sex with animals. It's radically different than the Jesus tale. But he says, well, there's a possibility. He ends with a very tentative conclusion. There's a possibility that maybe there's a prototype going on in the ancient world of a possibility of at least a disappearing God. In other words, it's only when you get to the Greeks that the gods become immortal forever, eternally. But you actually have a couple of gods that can die out in the ancient Near Eastern cultures. Osiris in the Egyptian culture, right? This is some scholars call him the Lego god because he's taken apart before he's dismembered, before he's killed, and he's put back together by his wife Isis, and she has to find the last member to have sex with him. Anyway, we won't get into it. But at the end of Riddle of the Resurrection, what you should hear is the conclusion by the scholar that's outside of the context of sort of North American and continental Jesus scholars. And he says, look, you can't say that Jesus is a legitimate. I've made a kind of a tentative case for the possibility of a type of disappearing or dying God. I don't know, you have to nuance the word return or resurrection to get that similarity. But he says, look, the riddle remains unsolved. This doesn't have any connection to first century Judaism and Jesus Christ. Even the figures I've gone over, Baal is radically different. So you would say, this doesn't have any play for Jesus, but it's at least kind of a proto-step that maybe there's something there in the ancient world about a dying and maybe either returning or a couple of gods. The question becomes, is there enough representation pre-Jesus to call it a motif or a theme? Because if it's not a motif or a theme, you're going to have a real hard time convincing scholars to look seriously at this sort of thing. So he tries to go towards that sort of proto-step. And it feels like he might have done, maybe. But he says, he makes it very clear at the end, about 2.5 pages near the end of the book, I should have had the quote here for you. He says, this has absolutely nothing to do with Jesus. If anybody's utilizing my book to kind of hammer the Christ story as inauthentic, this is the wrong way to go. So even he would say this isn't really the way to go that way. Yes?
So after I watched the Zeitgeist film,
yes.
I did a little research,
Okay.
just enough to see that some of these, there's no real evidence that they came prior to Jesus. Maybe they came along after Jesus. but Zeitgeist is presenting it as if it came before. What was the visit of the wise men and stuff like that? Can you tell us any of those that are really, they just got the whole order wrong?
Yes. I told you already that you don't really get Roman Mithras, where they have this, like for example, there's evidence from Tertullian, one of the early church fathers, that the followers of the secret initiative cult, we don't have a lot of information because it was a secret cult of Mithras, not the Persian Mithra, they did a cross of some sort on their heads. Now, you know, on Ash Wednesday for Roman Catholics, they put a cross on their head, and they're like, oh, you know, this sort of thing. The problem is, this isn't around until about 210 AD, right? And so what happens in Zeitgeist, you're like, Mithra came well before Jesus. And you're like, well, the Iranian Mithra, that has nothing, no connection to Christian piety, activity, theology, orthopraxis, nothing. And this one comes way too late. And there's still nothing. In other words, if it's coming around 210, 215, that looks like it might have been a copy of what the Christians were doing rather than the Christians copying it. There's a lot of that. That's one of the reasons, if you go to scholars that aren't Christians that try to connect data, they always say the most important thing is the original source data. The second is, can you determine conclusively, or at least really likely, that this came first? Now that's something they play with in Zeitgeist. They'll say something like, for example, people were worshiping Adonis well before Jesus ever came on the scene. Probably about, I would say, about 250, 243 BC. But you don't get any information about Adonis's, I guess you wouldn't call it a resurrection, he became a tree. You don't get any information about Adonis until around like 175. Any crucial sort of connective data, but that's way too late to influence the Jesus story. But you can say, well, this figure was worshipped before then. Maybe there's data, you know, before then. We just haven't found it yet. Now look, you guys know, tomorrow they could unearth something that would make this a more difficult thesis. But as it stands right now, you don't go, there's imaginary data out there somewhere for this, simply because the figure is there. Further, these religious traditions change radically over time. Radically change. In both their orthopraxis, how they practice their religion, as well as what they consider to be the most important parts of their religious traditions. That's another thing. Another thing to look at is what's called competition amongst manuscripts. If there's a lot of competing ideas as well as competing text about a figure, like for example with Horus, there are thousands of accounts of Horus over millennia. If you're just going to say, hey, I want to take all of these, I thought you're going to hit something like Jesus, right? I mean, hey, he's in the water here. You know, so that's the thing. So you've got to say, all right, if they're competing accounts, that's going to complicate the picture considerably. That is not even mentioned in Zeitgeist. You don't get that at all. So real quick, if you've seen that film, this gentleman is absolutely correct. There's a lot of times where they cheat. This is very common. And say, okay, this figure technically came before, but the data I'm working with came much, much later. In fact, you have a number of scholars that are non-evangelical conservatives that say, look, you've got a better chance of proving the idea that Christianity influenced the late worship of these former gods than you do saying Christianity was influenced by them. Very, very good. Yes?
So that's the case with Horus and Osiris too, that the original sources don't say that there's a resurrection or a virgin birth? No,
the closest you can get, I'll just give you one, the closest you can get in Horus to a resurrection is, and this is, again, there's a lot of stuff about Horus that's after the Jesus time period. There's a whole lot before, because the Egyptian culture and its ascendancy to power was well prior to the 1st century in Rome and Greece and that sort of thing. But the closest you can get is what's called it's on a stela, which is actually a piece of stonework that had hieroglyphics on it. It's called discovered by a gentleman named Metternich. It's called the Metternich stela. And on that stela, Isis, the mother of Horus, Osiris, Isis have sex. That's what virgin born either. They have sex. They have Horus. Horus and mom Isis are wandering around. They come into a city in the story on the stela, which we were able to translate through the Rosetta Stone. And they come into a city, and at this point, he's a toddler. Horus is a toddler. His uncle, the brother of Osiris, named Seth, right, knows mom and toddler in the city. So he magically sends scorpions to go and kill the toddler. And there's a question as to whether it was, it's unclear whether Horus was knocked out, unconscious, or dead. But we'll just say, we'll be generous and say he was dead, right? Isis comes back, she's upset, and then she gets a god named Thoth, who happens to be in the town with her, god of the underworld, along with her husband Osiris, but Osiris isn't back yet, brings Thoth over, and Thoth revives her son. Now, that's technically a return, but, like in Carrie S., or Dolores Burdock said, well, look, he was pierced, right? The scorpion. Right? Now, so That's where you're kind of going, this is a stretch, but that's the only example we have of a previous bit of actual data that says he had some type of return. Now, is it different than Jesus? Well, ISIS had to intervene and use her powers to bring another god in the fix, and together they brought him back. And there's so many dissimilarities. It's remarkably it's a remarkably bad parallel. Osiris, believe it or not, has a better chance. Osiris is called the god of the underworld when he died. He's kind of a mummy god. After his body was put back together and he was reconstituted and had sex with his wife Isis, he goes to rule the underworld forever. But that's not really. Jesus had a space-time resurrection, right? And he wasn't ruling hell. He's not going there to be kind of this mummy god that scares people as they come across the river Styx. So again, there was a better chance with Osiris, but people abandoned that because scholars said, this is garbage. This Lego god isn't anything like Jesus. It's so, and further, just think of it this way. The Jews, throughout the Old Testament, you see, what's the thing you cannot mix with your religious practice for Jews? Egyptian. Why? God brought them out of Egypt. I mean, remember the whole throwing the tablets down because they were worshiping an Egyptian? And by the way, that was a very common thing when you worship either an agricultural something or something that gave you something with regard to agriculture and livestock, a cow, a tree, this sort of thing. You can read Nehemiah. It's very clear you are cursed if you try to include religious themes in a Jewish setting. That's ridiculous. So the last place they're going to look for borrowing is the Egyptian culture. Not only are they really removed, first century fishermen, Jewish fishermen, well removed from the Exodus, but you've also got a strong tradition that says don't touch their religious. Remember what happened in Mount Sinai? See what I'm saying?
Question.
Yes.
Are you familiar with Patterns of Evidence, a documentary about re-examining Exodus?
I've got text at home. I don't know off the top of my head what I give, but let me give you this guy. I think you might find him helpful. We have in our worldview one of the most respected Egyptologists on the planet. I don't know if you knew this. His name is Kenneth Kitchen. Kenneth Kitchen, people hate the fact that he always defends the Old Testament because he's a walking encyclopedia. Kenneth Kitchen, by the way, he was one of the ones that Gass contacted about Tom Harper's 30+ Jesus parallels. If you read Kenneth Kitchen, you'll get a really good handle on, he talks a lot about the Epic of Gilgamesh, he talks a lot about ancient Egyptian culture, ancient Assyrian, ancient Philistine, ancient Hittite, that whole area of time around the Promised Land, the Exodus, the annexation, that sort of thing. He's right up to date with all the archaeology. In the technical literature, he's called an Old Testament maximalist. He thinks there is a maximal connection. I'm with him between the Old Testament history. There's others that say, no, minimalist. You know, there's some connection, but because there's supernatural elements in it, we're just going to say it's a minimal connection. But interestingly, just so you know this, one of the reasons scholars have largely left myth as an explanatory category for the New Testament or the Old Testament is because of archaeology. It's very clear that the spade is the friend, the archaeologist's spade is the friend of the Bible. There's never been something dug up that's confuted the word. And that's hard because what that means is the margin gets smaller and smaller. Like I was at TED's a couple of years ago with some youth pastors, and the guy who's a KSU student was our waiter. And he overheard us talking, and he said, I could help it over here, and I may kill my tip here. But, y'all really believe this stuff? I mean, you teach at the school, and he kind of couldn't believe we believe this stuff. And I said, yeah. So I waited for him to come back, and I said, well, just real quick, off the cuff, it's not going to cost you a tip. If I said Bible, what's your first thought? He thought mythology. And so when he came back, I thought I'd have a little fun. It probably, you'll be surprised at his reaction, but I said, he came back and said, hey, who dominated the Jews and enslaved them in the first century? I said, was it like aliens or Assyrians? Was it like people from Albania? He's like, oh, the Romans. I went, oh, that's in my Bible. That's not mythological. Well, then I ended up asking 3 or 4 more questions that were historical, right? And I said, well, you can't just pass it all off to myth, right? He comes back and goes, hey, you're not being very Christian. That was kind of having fun with me. And I said, you don't even believe in Christianity. What are you talking about me being I said, no, I was just having some fun. I don't think you can pass it off that easily to myth. I mean, God, we should probably do a whole other thing on why Jesus scholars have moved beyond myth. Even people that don't believe that he's actually Son of God and resurrected. This is almost gone. A myth explanation for, in other words, even scholars that disagree with our worldview would just say, I don't know. I'm going to just say ignorance on this. Almost no one says he wasn't a miracle worker. This is astounding. Past 250 years of Jesus research, if it's anything supernatural, it's got to be a myth. Well, now you got to try to show that. Well, nobody does that anymore. I'll cheat and give you one reason. One reason is, one of the things that historians think is authentic is when you see an embarrassing detail. If you're making up a story, you don't include embarrassing details about yourself. Start in Mark 1, right? Mark 1, you have a baptism of Jesus. You have a miracle happen in Mark 1, right? Well, wrapped up in that is an embarrassing detail. Why is the sinless Son of God getting baptized for the repentance? It was a baptism of repentance, John's baptism. Why do you even have him in that water under John the Baptist? John the Baptist is going, you shouldn't be in here. Yeah, you got that right. So why include that unless it happened? But the miracle's right there with it. If you move up to Mark 3, Jesus does some exorcisms, right? Mark 3 does some exorcisms. Then his family, embarrassing detail, he's crazy. Get him out of there. What is he talking about? He's embarrassing all of us. That is something people think is solidly historical. Right there is the exorcism with it. You move up to Mark 8, you have an embarrassing detail of Jesus not being, I don't even understand this one. Maybe you didn't have enough in the tank. Tries to heal the blind man. I see people that are moving like trees around me. Oh, now it's healed, right? That's an embarrassing detail, but the miracle's right there with it. So that's one of the reasons they moved off the myth, is it's wrapped up with what parts of the New Testament that are clearly seen as being largely historical because they wouldn't include it. You know, other embarrassing details, Peter denying Jesus, this sort of thing. Yes?
I don't want to get off the topic at all, but where do scholars attack Jesus and the Bible now? Like if I wanted to study that one.
Where they usually go is something like, well, the early church was overzealous and they might have, there's so much editorial activity we can't get back to it. Like, there's clearly an amount of editorial activity going on, but I don't think it disconfirms anything in the New Testament. So they would say, thanks for coming, by they would say, well, look, because there was this editorial activity, this could not be an inspired document. And if it's not an inspired document, then it's just a historic document that's really interesting, but therefore we have a defeater, right? And they would say, well, maybe if they did this kind of editing, there's all sorts of editing going on, right? Editing that's fully allowable in the genre of biography. But that's usually where they go. They say overzealous church members kind of believe that thesis is dying as well. But I just find it really interesting that people don't even offer an alternative resurrection story anymore because they know it'll be debunked almost immediately. Gary Habermas is the world's expert on resurrection right now. And Habermas says, look, when I go debate people in Europe and in America, they won't even give me an alternative to the resurrection because they know if the minute they give one, it'll be destroyed rationally. So they just say, I'm not even going to do it. I'm just going to say I don't believe. You got a question? You want to answer? Thanks. Yeah.
Considering that, like, for a lot of pre-Christian mythos and religions that are largely word of mouth, like the Epic of Gilgamesh.
Yes.
Just for an example, was word of mouth before it was like
written down, right?
Before it was written down, and even then, lots of original texts or original like plates or hieroglyphs or any kind of like writing on the Bible was largely destroyed.
Yes.
Either like by early Romans or much later by accident.
Yes.
How can we like for certain say that, especially because by word of mouth, that there couldn't be like any kind of more correlations between Jesus and other mythological figures without it just
here you go.
Like if it doesn't fit exactly, it has to be discredited.
No, I'm not saying exactly. I'm just saying it doesn't match criteria that other people use in other categories for connecting data. That's all. That's my thesis. Now, here's the thing. You mentioned something really important. Yeah, a lot of things are transmitted orally. But here's the problem. If we can't get our hands around it, I mean, you can say just about anything was said. You know, scholars aren't concerned with possibilities. They're concerned with probabilities. So you've got to have some sort of data to work with. I would also say, I thought you were going to go towards oral traditions unreliable, but you're saying, no, given the fact that we can't get our hands on these sort of things, I'm not saying it has to be an exact one-to-one match. That his mother better be named Mary. But you've got to be a little closer than they were both thought of it highly, had followers. That could account for almost a Hitler. You see what I'm talking about? So you need a little bit more scrutiny going on, like in any parallel case. But with regard to the oral tradition, yes, certainly there could be tomorrow. They could unearth something that was written down from an oral tradition that might challenge the gospel viability. But we don't have that, is what I'm trying to say right now. We really don't have that. And just to say, well, it could be, isn't really a strong argument. I mean, I wouldn't work on the other side. If I say, well, it could be that we have an even earlier document than, say, Luke, that goes right back to a year within Jesus' life. Well, yeah, there could be, especially if there's oral transmission and it's lost in the sands of Palestine. But nobody, no scholar's going to say, well, can't analyze that. What am I supposed to, what do I do with that? So again, you're exactly right in the sense that, yeah, a lot of things are orally transmitted. There's a lot of sometimes artwork and pre-linguistic cultures and things like that. Hieroglyphs, for goodness sake, are closer more to a pictorial-based language than a symbol-based language like ours. But even with that, we have quite a bit of data from the ancient world. And even the stuff we're missing, it's possible something could be unearthed, or possible that people are talking about these pre-Jesuses that look just like Jesus, but we need data to work with. If we don't have archaeological, epigraphic, or textual data, then all we've got is a speculation, and that doesn't usually pass muster. That isn't what you learn about at university, I don't think. So, that's where I would say, yeah, you're exactly right. Tomorrow, and yeah, we could find something, evidence of an oral tradition that would cause us to go back and relook at the data. But just to say I've won the day or even around a stalemate because of a possibility, just doesn't seem to be something that's heavily persuasive to scholars. And remember, just because something's possible doesn't mean it's probable. I mean, you can see this in your classes. Like if you were here at KSU and you were going to study every possible outcome of the Civil War, you'd never get done. You know what I mean? We have to go with what we have evidence of and look at what we have evidence of. Even if you try to even look at things that aren't as relevant, historians have to choose what's a relevant event versus an irrelevant. Like what if you were going to try to determine how many outhouses there were in the South during the Civil War? I mean, that's not really what historians focus on. So the point, I guess the point there is saying, well, it's not about possibilities, it's about probabilities. That's the whole gist of the academy. So yeah, it's possible, but that doesn't get you very far. Is the problem? And you're exactly right. There was a lot of oral transmission in the ancient world. But believe it or not, I don't find that to be less reliable. I actually find oral tradition to be, there's a lot more checks and balances on oral than some written. Again, that's probably a topic for another time too. Maybe we can come back and talk about it. What time do we have?
It's 9:12.
9:12. Okay, I think if anybody, unless anybody else got some questions, I think we'll shut it down.
I have a quick question.
Okay, yeah, go for it.
I just want to say also too, like in terms of embarrassment, like
Yes.
you know, some of the things that happen in the Old Testament. I think in like Numbers, I can't exactly remember the chapter and verse because I'm you know. But you know, I know God commanded the Israelites to go in and plumage, you know, villages, and there's a lot of, you know, skeptics and things that don't like, you know, the Old Testament, you know, for God being the way He was.
Genocidal,
right?
Pillaging, and the annexation.
So, you know, but to me, it's not necessarily embarrassing that, for instance, in this one account I'm referring to, he was, you know, the Israelites were commanded to go in and plumage a village, but they could take the young virgins for themselves, but everyone else needed to die, you know. And to me, that's not necessarily embarrassing, but you know, and I don't know the context of how the philosophy of the people in that, you know, in that area when it was written would have thought about that. But in our in our modern day understanding, it's like it really puts God in a non-ethical light.
Yeah, Richard Dawkins, he's a malevolent, bully, hypocritical, misogynistic. Yeah,
right. But my thing is like, why you know, it's not embarrassing, but it doesn't bode well for the viability of religion to allow their God to go in and plumage the village and yet keep the young virgins for themselves. Yeah. But maybe in their time that wasn't, you know, wrong or.
Yeah, I don't happen to believe he was giving them virgins for sexual use or anything like that.
Oh, okay.
That's a whole other time. But if you want a lay version of how to respond to this sort of thing, it's a really interesting read on this. Paul Copan's Is God a Moral Monster? It's a fantastic book. I think it's like $10 on Kindle. Mm-hmm. Paul Copan's God a Moral Monster discusses the very thing you're talking about. But more to your point, most scholars think almost the entire Old Testament is embarrassing. Jews have the longest history of being dominated and enslaved than nearly any other ancient culture. I mean, all the way up to Germany. And interestingly, they flourish in cultures where they're dominated. Flourish, especially financially. So some people would say, gosh, the Old Testament is rife with embarrassing details that you would never include unless they more likely were authentic than not. So really good points. I think you went more towards the embarrassing genocidal point. Why would you include this unless it actually happened? And just, I got to say at least one thing. When it came to how you treated slaves, which is a big difference between antebellum slavery and slaves in the ancient world, massive difference between the two. One's more like an indentured servant. Real quick, Roman emperors could have slaves and they could mobilize armies, capitally punish people, preside as judges, make, you know, have businesses. So very, very, very different, right? But slavery in the ancient world, the Jews treated their slaves better than anybody, better than anyone on the planet. Babylonians, brutal, right? Assyrians, Hittites. Egyptians, massively different. They were taught to help them assimilate as best they could. They couldn't go all the way and go into the temple, but this is where you get the foreigner. You know, the idea that they treat the foreigner almost like kin, and bringing them in and saying if they're willing to assimilate, go for it, right? So just a kind of a footnote on that as well. But a great book to look at, and again, we could probably talk about that at another time as well. That's an awesome topic. Okay, thank you guys. I appreciate you coming.